So here's a fascinating question. How do you get two completely different cultural systems, one from Japan and one from Europe, to lock together and form a kind of protective machine, a machine that ends up shielding and legitimizing some pretty troubling imagery? That's the puzzle we're going to take apart today.
Here's our roadmap. First, we're going to look at what the source calls the marionette in Japan, this cultural figure that's protected by a really specific legal shield. Then we'll jump over to Europe to understand the strings, which is this whole system of prestige and language that provides the justification. We'll dig into two powerful case studies, literature and cinema, to see how these strings really work before we put the whole machine together at the end.
All right, let's get right into it. Part 1, the marionette shield. This is all about a very particular legal and cultural bubble that exists in Japan.
So what exactly is this marionette? Well, you can think of it as this stylized figure, like you see in anime. For a long time, this figure was a way to express feelings of fragility and trauma after the war. But here's the key shift. Over time, that same stylized form has been transformed to carry a very different kind of charge, an erotic one. It's become what our source material calls a sexualized child image, and an entire apparatus of law, commerce, and fandom has built a protective wall around it.
So how did this protective shield get built in the first place? Well, this timeline tells a pretty clear story. Back in 2010, when Tokyo tried to put restrictions on certain comics, the industry pushed back hard, using the argument of freedom of expression. Then, in 2014, we see the crucial move. Japan finally outlaws the possession of child pornography. But, and this is the absolute key, it explicitly carves out an exception for manga and animation. The stylized fictional body gets a completely different legal status than a photo of a real person.
A year later, the UN gets involved, and its special rapporteur introduces this really powerful concept, banalization. What does that mean? It's the process where something shocking becomes normal through sheer repetition and stylization. The fictional framing softens our social alarm bells. The marionette, the stylized figure, basically becomes a tool for habituation, making something that should be horrifying feel like just another part of the commercial wallpaper.
And look, this isn't just happening in a vacuum. Recent research confirms this imagery is everywhere, and it's a big business. One 2024 study even found a link between heavy consumption of hentai and the endorsement of rape myths among college students. The point is, this legally protected marionette is part of a much bigger cultural ecosystem, one that can normalize these images and maybe even align with attitudes that weaken our resistance to real-world coercion.
Okay, so that's the marionette. But a marionette needs strings to move, right? And for those, we have to turn to a completely different place, Europe, and specifically a very particular tradition in France that provides the language to make it all seem okay.
So these strings are essentially the intellectual cover story. They're the words, the ideas, the cultural prestige that can take something really troubling and make it seem sophisticated or even necessary for art. They would dignifies the raw material, turning transgression into something that looks like high culture, philosophy, or some kind of liberation.
And where does this language even come from? Well, the source traces it straight back to the French intellectual scene of the late 1970s. In that post-1968 revolutionary climate, a lot of boundaries were being questioned, and questions about age of consent got framed in this language of radical freedom and fighting repression. This is really the moment where the strings start to get woven.
And let's be clear, this was not some fringe movement. We are talking about major public figures, people like Jack Lang, who would go on to be Minister of Culture, and Bernard Kouchner, a future foreign minister. They signed petitions calling to decriminalize pedophilia. This created what the source calls a long libertine prestige shield. And what's its function? It's to teach you, the audience, that feeling uncomfortable about certain things is actually a sign of depth, while objecting to them, well, that's just vulgar.
Okay, that's the theory. Let's make it way more concrete. Our first case study shows these literary strings in action, and it's centered on one specific author.
The author's name is Gabriel Matzneff, and his story is maybe the single clearest, most chilling example of how this whole string function actually works. Just listen to that wording from Reuters. It wasn't a secret. For decades, Matzneff was celebrated by the cultural elite while he was publicly talking about this. This tells you the prestige machine wasn't just ignoring it, it was actively managing it. This whole thing was happening right out in the open with the full blessing of the literary world.
So how in the world did the literary strings pull this off? It was like a kind of dark alchemy. Step 1, you reframe predation as some kind of intellectual journey. Step 2, you present the massive power imbalance of age as a form of sophisticated refinement. And Step 3, you perform the final trick, converting material that in any other context would just look like predation into symbolic literary value. You turn it into art. Now let's move to an even more powerful medium, cinema. Because here, the strings get a whole institutional apparatus to work with. Film festivals, awards ceremonies, the whole shebang.
And of course, the classic example here is Roman Polanski. I mean, when he won France's biggest directing award in 2020, people literally walked out. But just look at the defense from the industry. You have to separate the film from the man. That is the string function in its absolute purest form. The institution itself provides the interpretive lens that lets the art float free from the artist's actions, telling us that a sophisticated viewer knows how to suspend normal judgment.
But that story is changing. And in recent years, a massive reckoning has been led by figures like the actress Judith Godrèche, who basically zoomed the camera out from individual directors to show that the entire system was the problem.
And her choice of words here is just devastatingly precise. She didn't just talk about abuse. She called it the illicit trafficking of young women in the cinema industry. That phrase is so critical because it names the system itself. It's about the circulation of young women's bodies through a prestige machine where art, power, and desire are all completely tangled together.
Godrèche filed complaints against the directors Benoît Jacot and Jacques Doyon, and in doing so, she helped expose what our source calls the Pygmalion machine. We all know the script, right? The older male genius discovers the young actress and shapes her, but this story is just a disguise for a structure of control and grooming, presenting it as artistic mentorship. This is the cinematic string function at its most powerful. The prestige of filmmaking becomes the fancy wrapping paper that makes a relationship of domination look like a work of art.
Okay, so we have our two distinct pieces, the marionette from Japan and the strings from Europe. Now, let's put the machine together and see how it functions as a single, coherent system.
The way these two parts fit together is really the whole story. Japan's cultural industry provides the marionette, the visible, stylized, child-coded figure that's protected by this legal shield of expressive freedom. And at the exact same time, Europe's cultural field provides the strings, the intellectual language that dignifies an interest in that figure, framing it as cultural sophistication or artistic freedom. One culture provides the object, the other provides the excuse.
Which leaves us with a pretty stark final question. When you combine a legal shield for a fictional body with a cultural language of prestige that provides the justification, what does that machine ultimately teach us to see? What does it normalize? And maybe more importantly, what does it teach us to ignore? That's something to think about.